The Game Boy is an 8-bit handheld video game device developed and manufactured by Nintendo. It was released in Japan on April 21, 1989, April 21, 1989, in North America in Augusta 1989, 1989-08, and in Europe on September 28, 1990, September 28, 1990. It is the first handheld console in the Game Boy line, and was created by Gunpei Yokoi in Nintendo Research and Development 1, the same staff who had designed the Game & Watch series as well as several popular games for the Nintendo Entertainment System. Redesigned versions were released in 1996 and 1998, in the form of Game Boy Pocket and Game Boy Light, respectively. The Game Boy is Nintendo's second handheld system following the Game & Watch series introduced in 1980, and it combined features from both the Nintendo Entertainment System and Game & Watch. It was originally bundled with the puzzle game Tetris. As part of the fourth generation of gaming, the Game Boy competed with the Sega Game Gear, Atari Lynx, and the Turbo Express. Despite these other technologically superior handheld consoles, the Game Boy was a tremendous success. The Game Boy and its successor, the Game Boy Color, have both combined sold 118.69 million units worldwide. Upon its release in the United States, it sold its entire shipment of 1 million units within a few weeks. Hardware. The Game Boy has 4 operation buttons labeled A, B, Select, and Start, as well as a directional pad. There is a volume control dial on the right side of the console and a similar knob on the left side to adjust the contrast. At the top of the Game Boy, a sliding on-off switch and the slot for the Game Boy cartridges are located. Nintendo recommends users leave a cartridge in the slot to prevent dust and dirt from entering the system. The Game Boy also contains optional input and/or output connectors. On the left side of the system is an external power supply jack that allows users to use an external rechargeable battery pack or AC adapter instead of 4 AA batteries. The Game Boy requires 6 of VDC of at least 150 mA. A 3.5 ohm stereo headphone jack is located on the bottom side of the console, which allows users to listen to the audio with headphones or speakers. The right side of the device offers a port which allows a user to connect to another Game Boy system via a link cable, provided both users are playing the same game. The port can also be used to connect a Game Boy printer. The link cable was originally designed for players to play head-to-head two-player games such as in Tetris. However, game developer Satoshi Tajiri would later use the link cable technology as a method of communication and networking in the popular poker copyright Mon video game series. Technical specifications. CPU, custom 8-bit Sharp LR35902 core at 4.19 MHz. This processor is similar to an Intel 8080 in that none of the registers introduced in the Z80 are present. However, some of the Z80's instruction set enhancements over the stock 8080, particularly bit manipulation, are present. Still other instructions are unique to this particular flavor of Z80 CPU. The core also contains integrated sound generation. RAM, 8 KB internal SRAM, video RAM, 8 KB internal, ROM, on CPU die 256-byte bootstrap. 256 KB, 512 KB, 1 MB, 2 MB, 4 MB and 8 MB cartridges, sound, 2 pulse wave generators, 1 PCM 4-bit wave sample channel, 1 noise generator, and 1 audio input from the cartridge. The unit only has 1 speaker, but headphones provide stereo sound. Display, reflective station LCD 160 144 pixels, frame rate, approximately 59.7 frames per second on a regular Game Boy, 61.1 on a Super Game Boy, vertical blank rate, approximately 1.1 on this, screen size, 66 on diagonal, color palette, 2-bit, communication, up to 2 Game Boys can be linked together via built-in serial ports, up to 4 with a DMG07 4-player adapter. Power, 6V, 0.7 W, dimensions, 90 mm, 148 mm, 32 ohm/3.5 a euro cubed, 5.8 a euro cubed, 1.3 a euro cubed, launch games, revisions, play it loud. On January 1, 1995, Nintendo released several Game Boy models with colored cases, advertising them in the Play It Loud campaign. Specifications for this unit remain exactly the same as the original Game Boy, including the monochromatic screen. This new line of colored Game Boys would set a precedent for later Nintendo handhelds. The Game Boy Pocket, the Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance, Nintendo DS, and Nintendo 3DS all feature different colored units. Play It Loud units were manufactured in red, green, black, yellow, white, blue, and clear cases. Most common are the clear and yellow. Black, red and green are less common. Blue is scarce and the white was a Japanese-only release. White remains the rarest of all the Play It Loud colors. A rare, limited edition Manchester United Game Boy is red, with the logos of the team emblazoned on it. It was released simultaneously with the Play It Loud handhelds in the United Kingdom. The Play It Loud screens also have a darker border than the normal Game Boy. Game Boy Pocket. In 1996, Nintendo released the Game Boy Pocket, a smaller, lighter unit that requires fewer batteries. It has space for 2 AAA batteries, which provides approximately 10 hours of gameplay. The Pocket has a smaller link port, which requires an adapter to link with the older Game Boy. The port design is used on all subsequent Game Boy models, excluding the Game Boy Micro. The screen was changed to a true black and white display, rather than the pea soup monochromatic display of the original Game Boy. Also, the Game Boy Pocket has a larger screen than the Game Boy Color that later superseded it. The GBP screen has a 65 ohm diagonal, 48.5 ohm width, and 43.5 ohm height, compared to a 59 ohm diagonal for the GBC. Although, like its predecessor, the Game Boy Pocket has no backlight to allow play in a darkened area, it did notably improve visibility and pixel response time. The first version did not have a power LED. This was soon added due to public demand, along with new Game Boy Pocket units of different colors, some of them new to the Game Boy line. There were several limited edition Game Boy Pockets including a metallic ice blue unit and a pink model exclusive to Japan. The Game Boy Pocket was not a new software platform and played the same software as the original Game Boy model. Game Boy Light. The Game Boy Light was released on April 14, 1998 for a 6,800 yen and was only available in Japan. The Game Boy Light is only slightly bigger than the Game Boy Pocket and features an electroluminescent backlight for low light conditions. It uses 2 AA batteries, which gave it approximately 20 hours with the light off and 12 with it on. It was available in 2 standard colors, gold and silver, as well as numerous special editions, an Astro Boy edition with a clear case with an Astro Boy picture on it, an Osamu Tezuka World Shop edition with a clear red case and a picture of his characters, a solid yellow poker copyright Mon Center Tokyo version, a clear skeleton Famitsu edition which had only 5,000 units released, and a clear yellow edition separate from the poker copyright Mon Center Tokyo version. It was the only handheld Nintendo produced with a Lita screen until the release of the Game Boy Advance SP in 2003. Reception. In its first 2 weeks in Japan, from its release on April 21, 1989, the entire stock consisting of 300,000 units was sold. A few months later, the Game Boy's release in the United States on July 31, 1989 saw 40,000 units sold on its first day. The Game Boy and Game Boy Color combined have sold 118.69 million units worldwide, with 32.47 million units in Japan, 44.06 million in the Americas, and 42.16 million in other regions. By Japanese fiscal year 1997, before Game Boy Color's release in late 1998, the Game Boy alone has sold 64.42 million units worldwide. At the time of his release, the Atari Lynx was also just being introduced to the market. This system featured color graphics, a backlit screen, and networking capabilities. However, its release price of $189.95 and substantial requirement of 6 AA batteries that would provide roughly only 4 or 5 hours of gameplay doomed it to a second-rate status. Nintendo also experienced heavy competition from Sega's Game Gear. To promote its new color console, Sega aired a number of negative ad campaigns in the United States that mocked the Game Boy's monochrome display compared to Game Gear's full-color display. Like the Lynx, it too required 6 AA batteries that only lasted about €6 hours and was much more expensive than the Game Boy. However, the Game Gear had the advantage of being fully compatible with all Master System games. While not as successful as the Game Boy, it sold from 1991 until early 1997, and sold around 11 million units in total. In 1995, Nintendo of America announced that 46% of Game Boy players were female, which was higher than the percentage of female players for both the Nintendo Entertainment System and Super Nintendo Entertainment System. In 2009, the Game Boy was inducted into the National Toy Hall of Fame, 20 years after its introduction. As of June 6, 2011, Game Boy and Game Boy Color games are available on the Virtual Console service on the Nintendo 3DS's Nintendo eShop. See also: List of Game Boy colors and styles, List of games for the original Game Boy, Game Boy accessories, Game Boy Advance, Game Boy line, Microvision, the first handheld to use cartridges, references. Game Boy Compact Video Game System Owner's Manual. Nintendo. 1989. DMG-GB UK via, Kent, Stephen L. The Ultimate History of Video Games. Roseville, California, Prima Publishing. ISBN A0-7615-3643-4, handheld electronic game, design patent for the case, external links, media related to Game Boy at Wikimedia Commons, official website, GameBoy@Nintendo.com, Game Boy Games List at Nintendo.com, Game Boy at DMOZ, Game Boy at Nintendopedia.